Up until I was in junior high, I was always a shy kid and had trouble making friends. Needless to say, I used to play alone all the time. One of the things I did on my own was tossing the baseball high up and catching it on the way down. I did that a lot, especially because my dad wasn't really involved in my life. Anyway, this one day after school, I was playing catch on my own in my backyard. My baseball looked almost brand new since it was never hit with a bat or dropped on an actual baseball field. I always played catch in the backyard, and our backyard is covered with grass. It was kinda sad why the ball looked brand new, but in any case, it looked new. I got bored playing catch after 5 minutes. I sort of spoke loudly as I said, "Last throw, let's make it a high one." I threw the ball high up and then it didn't drop back down. I threw the ball up fairly high and pretty fast, but definitely not at the speed of the escape velocity of Earth. So then where was it? I looked up in the sky and there was nothing. Could it have been dropped on the roof of our house? This wasn't really possible in that I would have heard it hitting the roof. As you are all aware, baseballs are hard and somewhat heavy for its size. There's absolutely no way that it doesn't make a loud sound when it drops on a hard surface. So there I was, completely dumbfounded by what had just transpired. Then suddenly something heavy dropped right next to my feet and it gave me quite a scare. I looked down and saw a baseball. And I say a baseball because it wasn't mine. The ball looked worn and old. It had lots of scuff marks and some of the stitches were all shredded. I picked it up and inspected it. It definitely wasn't mine. I never got my ball back, but I did end up keeping the old and worn baseball that just fell from the sky. Till this day, I've got no clue as to what happened to my ball and how that old baseball just appeared out of nowhere. I have no theory of what could have possibly happened. I can safely say that it'll remain a mystery until the day I die. I have 2 bulldogs named Ben and Jerry. They're brothers and I thought it was clever to give them the names, only to find out later that I wasn't all that original. In any case, I was rewatching The Exorcist the other day, and as per usual, Ben and Jerry were enjoying the film as well. I'm not really sure that they actually enjoy watching TV, but it's funny how they can't get their eyes off the screen when I turn it on. So anyway, at some point, we get to the scene of the possessed girl head spinning and the walls cracking and whatnot. Ben freaks out a little, but Jerry seems calm enough. Or at least, that's what I thought initially. Because in reality, Jerry was actually staring at the window behind the TV. Seconds pass by when Ben runs upstairs and I hear my wife going goo goo gaga at him. Then out of nowhere, Jerry runs toward the window and starts barking like he's ready to kill something. I unknowingly shouted out, "That's enough, Jerry, bad dog, go upstairs." I was going to get up and pick him up, but it became unnecessary. Jerry backed away from the window, and I mean he literally backed away, pushing his butt instead of turning his body and walking straight. He kept his sight glued to the window, and that really got my attention. I thought perhaps it could be a person outside, possibly an intruder. I grabbed a baseball bat that I kept right next to the fireplace, then headed outside through the front door. I went around the house twice because I couldn't find anyone. So then I came to a conclusion that Jerry is a cute dog, but he ain't a guard dog. When I went back inside the house, I saw Jerry sitting on his own piss and defecation. I screamed, "Oh, what the hell, Jerry?" And then I got worried. Jerry wasn't reacting at all to what I was saying. He was staring at something with his head looking up at about 45-degree angle. He was frozen in that state. I picked him up, took him to the bathroom, and washed off all the crap on his body. He wasn't reacting at all while I was scrubbing every part of his body. He normally hates taking baths. I had never seen him like that. After the bath, he didn't shake his body to get rid of the excess moisture as he normally does. He was still out of it. I didn't know what else to do, so I took him upstairs and had him sleep next to me that night. I figured I'd take him to the vet the next morning. I woke up at 9 a.m. the next day. It was a Saturday and I wanted to squeeze in a couple of hours of extra sleep. I went downstairs after washing up and Jerry looked to have come back to himself. I was going to take him out for a walk and thus I called for my wife so we could go together. It seemed like she wasn't at home, so I went to the backyard to see if she was tending to the garden. When I opened the back door, right away could hear a commotion outside. I went around the front of the house and saw a bunch of people from the neighborhood gathered in front of my house. My wife was there and I asked her what was happening. She answered, "Jamie hung herself in the basement. She died last night and no one knew until this morning when her husband and children had come back from their short trip. Apparently, she had asked him for some time alone. She's been going through some things and it looks like she's planned for this for some time. Jamie was our neighbor, and the truth is, no one liked her because she was rude and really just a mean woman. I had no idea she had psychological issues, but I suppose we never know what happens behind the closed doors. I walked away since my wife was still busy talking to the others and headed back home to take Ben and Jerry out for a walk. That's when it hit me. Could she have died around the time Jerry was freaking out? It was ridiculous in a way, but it also made too much sense. If you believe in ghosts, then it makes perfect sense. But if you're not one of those people, then what happened the previous night is all but a coincidence. I'm not sure what it was, but I can tell you with confidence that I had never seen Jerry act that way before. That was the only time that freaked out on that fateful night. Jerry's been fine ever since, and all's been good in the house. I guess there's no point in speculation, but I still find the happening of that night really creepy. My grandpa passed away last year, and I was sad about the whole deal, but for all the wrong reasons. He and we didn't have much of a relationship. Grandpa was a stoic, reclusive old man who I only saw once when he came to my home to take care of some business he had with Dad. Apparently, my father needed his father to sign over some documents. For the brief moment that it was in my house, Grandpa didn't even acknowledge my existence, let alone say hi to me. And that was the extent of our relationship. So then it puzzles me till this day why he would have named me the sole beneficiary of his will. Because I tell you, he had a lot more money in his savings than one might imagine. Aside from the money, he had also left me the cabin where he has spent his final years, along with his truck and his dog Gilbert. When Grandpa passed away after spending 3 days at the hospital, I didn't shed a single tear. You see, that's what made me so sad. The fact that I didn't have any connection with him to feel some kind of a loss. Perhaps leaving me with everything he owned in his life was his way of making it up to me for all the time lost. I would have preferred a relationship over things. Regardless, I decided to adopt Gilbert, but I was selling the truck and the cabin. The truck was easy enough to get rid of. I got $500 for the junk and used most of the money on Gilbert. I took him to the vet, got him some toys, and bought a bunch of fancy dog food. I was concerned about selling the cabin, but that wasn't much of a problem either, thanks to a guy who wanted the land the structure was sitting on. A week before closing the sale of the property, for whatever reason, I had this urge to go and look at it one last time. I was there once when Grandpa passed away. I was there to empty out the cabin of his belongings. This time, however, I didn't have any reason to be there, but I just wanted to go there. I arrived at the cabin the next day at around 10 in the morning. I took Gilbert with me, and he seemed to be really happy and sad at the same time. It was his home for 5 years, but his owner wasn't there to greet him. Seeing Gilbert like that, it made me realize that the old man did have the capacity to love some things. I entered the empty cabin and looked around trying to imagine what life might have been like for Grandpa. I was in there for a couple of minutes when Gilbert started scratching at the wall near the kitchen. He was whimpering and looked at me a few times as if he needed my help. I walked toward them and realized there was a tiny gap between the wall panels. I got closer and looked through the narrow space. I had found several notebooks in there. I took them out and began reading. They were diaries Grandpa had written over the years. As for the contents of the diary, I'll have to give you a condensed version of it. In it, he basically noted that he suffers from terrible nightmares. He dreamt about doing horrible things to the people he loves. He had those dreams ever since he was a child. Once he got married and had children of his own, he began to fear that he might act out his dreams. He had a good reason for that too. He was a sleepwalker. That's the reason why he distanced himself from his wife and children. He divorced Grandma at the age of 40. But in the journal, he mentions how painful it was for him to leave her. He wrote that he loved her too much to risk hurting her in real life. The terrible dreams never stopped, and he couldn't trust himself anymore. Leaving his family was his way of protecting them. I sat on the floor of the cabin and spent the next 5 hours reading all the journals. I had never cried so much in my life. I couldn't imagine how painful it must have been for him to act the way he did toward us when his heart was full of love. In the end, I opted not to sell the cabin. I spoke to the buyer and explained to him why I wanted to keep it. He sympathized with my situation and agreed to write up a new contract to only purchase half the plot of land. I would keep half the property with the cabin, and he would get the other half of land for his needs. It was a fair deal. I later invited all of my family for a backyard barbecue and showed them the journals when the day was coming to an end. Grandma, Dad, and Uncle, they were all in tears. Ever since then, we've been going to the cabin a couple of times a year so we could remember Grandpa and also to spend some family time. Grandpa's sacrifice has brought the family closer together. Gilbert, my grandpa's only family in the latter years of his life, made that happen. His best friend made it possible for us to learn the truth and to appreciate Grandpa for who he really was. I wish I could have gotten to know the man. I hope he at least knows we all love him. So there's this house in our neighborhood that's supposedly haunted. Some people swear they've seen a ghost on that property, and some say the haunting is all a nonsense. The funny thing is, the house isn't your typical haunted mansion. It's a normal-looking, clean 2-story house, and on top of that, a nice family lives there. I know the family because I tutor math to the younger kid 3 times a week. I sometimes babysit for the parents when they go out for dinner and stuff. Anyway, the family tells me they've never seen a ghost in the house, and I believe them too because I've never seen one either whenever I was in their home. Then one night, Mr. and Mrs. Hammond had asked me to look after their kids from the hours of 7 p.m. through 10 p.m. I gladly said yes, since it meant more money for the weekend for a date with my new girlfriend. However, on that day, I had to bring my dog Sasha to their home. She's an old gal and doesn't have much time left in this world. I had to take her to the vet in the morning, and she was still really sluggish at night. My parents were also out, and I didn't want to leave Sasha alone in the house. Mr. Hammond was okay with me bringing her over, and so I did. Sasha looked anxious even before she entered the house. I figured she was acting that way since she hasn't been to other people's home in a long while. You see, we barely took her out after she began to show her age. I took her to the backyard to do the doo-doo, and that's the extent of her daily outings. Anyway, I put the kids to bed at 8:30 at night, then came downstairs to burn the time until Mr. and Mrs. Hammond would come back. I sat on the couch and began playing games on my phone. Sasha sat right next to me, but I noticed she wouldn't stop looking at the front door. She had that frightened look on her face, and I knew something was bothering her. I put the phone down and walked to the front door. While looking at Sasha, I said, "This is a door, and there's nothing here. I know your friends might have told you that this house is haunted, but I promise you, you've got nothing to be scared of." Then suddenly, Sasha growled at me for the first time in her life. That's why I knew she wasn't growling at me, but at something else that was near me. For some reason, she was able to see or sense something, but my eyes could see nothing. Seconds later, Sasha was barking so loudly that I had to take her out of the house. Outside, she was still looking at the door and continued to growl at something. I took her further away from the front door, and it was only then that she began to calm down. I had to wait outside until Mr. and Mrs. Hammond came back home. I told them that Sasha wasn't comfortable in a new surrounding, but that I checked on the kids every half hour, which I did. They were okay with that, and that was the end of it. I can't be sure, but I think there's something about that house that affects certain people and likely all animals. One thing that I noticed is the lack of pets in the Hammond household. They've got no dogs, cats, birds, or any other animal in the house. I think there's something about that house they're not telling us. Maybe they want to sell it, but they first have to convince the neighborhood that it isn't haunted. I can't say for sure, and that's why I quit babysitting for them. I still tutor the younger kid, but I no longer do it in their house. It happens in my house now. I've had Sasha since she was just a puppy, and I've never seen her that agitated. Ghost or no ghost, I just don't want to go back to a house where Sasha feels so unsafe. In the summer of 1992, I was staying at my uncle's for 2 weeks while my parents were working out their differences. That's what they told me they were doing at the time, and they needed me out of the picture for a while. Obviously, they were having trouble in their marriage and were likely deciding on how to part ways. Anyhow, Mom dropped me off on a Tuesday, and I remember she looked really sad. Before leaving, she told me she was sorry and that she'd come back as soon as she could. As for Uncle Mason, he's an okay dude. He hardly speaks and is kind of a loner, but it's not because he's a bad person or because he doesn't care. Uncle had always been like that. He's not comfortable with people, but then he doesn't bother anyone either. So that, in my book, is totally fine. On the first night of staying in his place, I remember him asking me if he needed to read me a story or something similar to put me to sleep. Now mind you, I was 12 years old at the time. I said to him, "Uncle, I'm 12 years old and not 2. Don't get me wrong, I didn't say it in a demeaning manner. I had a smile on my face and I was only kidding with him. I can't say for sure, but I think I almost made him laugh. I might have seen the corner of his mouth move a little. That was kind of funny. But yeah, I couldn't fall asleep until midnight due to the concerns I had for my parents and as well as for the fact that I wasn't sleeping in my room. I got up and went to the bathroom to take a piss. As I returned to the room, I left the door slightly ajar to let in a little bit of light from the hallway. I returned to bed but still had my eyes open. I was looking out the window for a while when I felt a strange sensation that someone was watching me. I sat up and looked around the room, but there was no one. I was about to lie down again, but something by the door caught my eye. It seemed like Uncle was standing in the hallway and looking into my room. I got up, then went to the hallway, but Uncle wasn't there. I just stood there for a while, kinda puzzled at the situation. Then for a split of a second, I could have sworn I saw a shadow melt into a wall. The figure of the shadow looked humanoid and it moved fast. Believe it or not, I wasn't really scared. I had always been fascinated with the afterlife, spirits, demons, you name it. I've read a lot about those things and I was an inquisitive kid. The happening, while kind of scary, it was a lot more exciting to me. The next night, when I went to bed, I pretended to fall asleep real quick and waited for the shadow person to come back. I must have waited for at least an hour when it reappeared by the door. I patiently waited, and this time it actually came into the room. I had the blanket covering most of my face, but left just enough room for one of my eyes to observe the being. Once it was inside the room, I could no longer tell where it was. The room was in total darkness, and the only lights coming in were from the window and from the door that was slightly ajar. About a minute later, I saw it. The shadow was hovering on top of me, and it looked to be watching me curiously. The moonlight was bright enough for me to distinguish the shape of the shadow in the darkness. Then suddenly, I heard a door opening out in the hallway, and the shadow quickly disappeared. I thought that would be the end of the night, but it wasn't. Just seconds after the shadow had left, I heard Uncle talking to someone out in the hallway. It was too much of a coincidence for the shadow to leave my room as soon as Uncle came out of his room, and then for him to engage in a conversation with someone, even though there were only two of us in the house. I couldn't hear the conversation without alerting of my movement. The bed was too creaky for me to get up quietly. So till this day, I have no clue as to what Uncle must have said to the shadow being. But I am 100% certain that he did speak to it. The shadow person didn't come back after that night. I was very disappointed because I was hoping to find out more about the being. I never spoke to Uncle about the happening, and I've got no plans to do so now. I'm still curious, but as I gotten older, I come to realize that some things are better left unknown. This is one of them. I was in 5th grade when my class went to a summer camp for a field trip. The trip was planned for 3 days, and we were supposed to learn about nature, outdoor survival, and some other useless things you forget once you go back home. Day 1 was mostly spent unpacking, doing the introduction, and a campfire at night. It was on day 2 when we finally got to do some things out in the woods. The guide showed us some insects, taught us how to tie different knots, and some basic things about navigating in the woods. Most of the kids had their own little group. I, for example, was with my friends Sean and Patrick. But there was this kid named Lester who had no friends to hang out with. Of course, the whole class was in the same area, but none of the classmates would speak to him or do things together with him. I thought about bringing him into our group, but I just didn't have the balls to befriend the official loser of our class. Believe me, I'm ashamed to admit that. Anyhow, we participated in several different activities during the day. We had fun for the most part, and the time was about 5 p.m. by the time the teachers wrapped up all the outdoor activities. We weren't too far deep in the woods, but our teacher, along with the teachers of other classes, began doing head counts for their respective classes. Everyone was present, for the exception of Lester. Our teacher, Mr. Hammond, called out for Lester, but he didn't answer the call. He began to panic and asked the other teachers for help to look for him. 2 out of the 5 teachers led us back to the camp, while the guides and the rest of the teachers continued the search for Lester. Night came, the police had arrived by then, but Lester was still not found. Up to that point, I had never seen a grown man cry in real life. But on that night, Mr. Hammond turned on the waterworks and no one was able to console him. As you might imagine, the mood in the camp was somber and subdued. I went to bed that night feeling guilty for not bringing in Lester into our group. I kept asking myself why I wasn't brave enough to not be swayed by what others may think. I was raised to do the right thing, but my actions spoke otherwise. I felt ashamed. Morning came and I woke up to the screams and laughter coming from the outside. A few other kids and I who woke up stepped outside to check out what the commotion was all about. When we opened the door and took a few steps toward the main building, we saw that Lester had come back. He had a blanket draped over him, but I could still tell he was fully naked underneath. He seemed to be in a state of shock as he didn't respond to the people around him. I walked over to him and one of the teachers was about to stop me when Mr. Hammond intervened. I said to Lester, "Hey, we're all glad to see you back." Lester didn't even look at me. Talking to him was no different than talking to a mannequin. It was as if only the shell of Lester had come back. I don't have much information on what happened to him after that. Lester was taken on an ambulance and the rest of us had left the camp on the same day. I learned of some additional information about Lester later in life. Apparently, the police had no clue how Lester had come back to the camp without being seen. There were close to 100 people out searching for him, not to mention that plenty of adults were near the camp. It seemed impossible for them to not notice Lester until he walked right into the camp. As for what happened to Lester after that day, I hear his mind had never come back to him. He's been in that vegetative-like state ever since that day. But that's about the extent of information I've got on him as far as his current state of health is concerned. Till this day, no one's really figured out what happened to Lester at the camp. We don't understand how he was able to make his way back to the camp when his mind was completely blank. It's by far the darkest memory in my life, and it's rather unpleasant to think about it even as an adult. It's a real shame that I didn't have the guts to invite him into our group. If I had the means to go back in time, I would do things differently. I truly would. I was 12 years old when my parents sent me off on a 2-week-long college camp. There, we were to learn about working in the medical industry. We had professors and doctors come talk to us about becoming a biologist, MD, and medical scientist. It was by far the best camp I had ever been to as far as the quality of education is concerned. We used the empty dorm rooms for sleeping accommodations. The one downside of the camp was the lack of air conditioners in the middle of the summer. The windows were bottom hinged that only opens slightly at the top, restricting airflow. Not to mention there were plenty of insects outside. The nights were as miserable as they can get. My roommate was this kid named James. He was friendly and talkative. I lucked out as far as roomie was concerned. Although, to my credit, James thought the same of me. We got along really well, and that helped us cope with the miserable nights. We enjoyed talking to one another so much that most nights we fell asleep in the middle of conversations. Then I believe it was on the night of day 6 when we found out something useful by chance. You see, the security guard does sweeps of the dorms a few times every night. The last sweep is done at midnight, then he never comes back. So on the 6th night, we left our door open after midnight, hoping that it would help with the airflow. To our surprise, it did, by a lot. James and I fell asleep, but I woke up sometime later. I thought I heard a noise out in the hallway, and that's likely what woke me up. I got up and poked my head out the door. That's when I saw a man enter a room down the hallway. I tiptoed toward the room and peeked inside ever so slightly. It was the room occupied by Jason and Luke. In the room, the man had a scissor in his right hand and was about to snip a lock of hair of one of the kids. I quickly tiptoed back to my room and woke up James. The plan was to go to the teacher's room and take James with me for safe measure. But by the time James had woken up, the man was out in the hallway. I shut the door quietly and dragged the chair toward it. I propped it underneath the doorknob just like in the movies. James and I held on to the chair and dreadfully waited for the creep to reach our room. Minutes had passed when someone twisted our doorknob, but the door wouldn't budge. James and I were terrified. I struggled to breathe as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I looked at James and he wasn't faring any better. The man struggled with the doorknob for a while but quit after about a minute. I heard the footsteps moving toward the next room. We failed to fall asleep after that. We went straight to one of the teachers in the morning and told her everything about the previous night. That day, we had about a dozen campus police interviewing people and searching different buildings. They found the creep before the day was over. It was one of the security personnel the camp had hired. The creep was caught while trying to get rid of the evidence, the lock of hairs he had collected. The campus police saw him dump a black plastic bag in one of the large dumpsters. They stopped him and searched the contents of the bag. The hairs of the kids were found inside. He was arrested on the spot and had to do some time for his crime. I believe my parents know the details of the case, but I never asked them about it. I was always curious, but I think I just wanted to move on from the incident. I really hope the creep never got to work around kids ever again. This incident happened 14 years ago, not long after I turned 13. It was in the middle of July, and my parents had signed me up for summer camp. Physical activity was the core value of the camp. I was a bit overweight at the time, and I suppose my parents wanted to help me get in shape. At the camp, we did lots of swimming and hiking, mixed in with some basketball and soccer. All activities ended at 5 p.m., then the rest of the day was filled with speeches, games, and/or reading sessions. We were sent to our room by 7 in the evening and showers were mandatory. Basically, we had 2 hours of free time until bedtime at 9. I fell asleep around 9:30, but my roommate woke me up at 2 in the morning. Kane whispered to me to be quiet, pointed at the window, walked toward it, then gestured for me to come. I walked up to the window, but then Kane quickly pushed my shoulder down. There were people out in the yard, and he didn't want us to be seen by them. The people outside were wearing strange clothing. They looked ritualistic. Imagine a cape with different shades of dark colors. Then make some cuts from shoulder high to all the way down to the bottom. That's what I saw these people were wearing. They looked strange and scary. Upon further inspection, I was able to identify the individuals as our teachers. They had torches in their hands and were mumbling something that I couldn't comprehend. After a couple of minutes, a group of teachers separated further away into a large circle. That's when I saw a kid lying on a wooden table. The kid seemed to be unconscious as the ritual proceeded. They used strange-looking knives to mimic slicing and stabbing motions on the child. I would cringe and twitch every time the knives got near the kid's body. The ritual continued for about half an hour. At the very end, they poured wine on the child's belly and drank the spills dripping off his waist. I think the wine symbolized the blood. Essentially, our teachers wanted to stab us and drink our blood. Suffice it to say, I was terrified and could hardly fall asleep that night. Come morning, I told the teachers I had to make a phone call to my parents. We weren't allowed to make calls during the camp, but I lied to them that my sinus was acting up. I told them I had to go back home to see my doctor. It's true that I had suffered from sinus infection quite often, but it was a lie that it was affecting me at that point in time. I had to go home. I needed an excuse, one that my parents would buy as well. Sinus infection was the perfect excuse to get me out of there. Meanwhile, Kane couldn't come up with anything and they remained at the camp. However, I did get the phone number of his parents to get him out of there somehow. I told my parents about the ritual on the ride back home. I also gave them the number of Kane's parents. We stopped at a rest area and Dad got out of the car to speak to Kane's parents. I know that Kane was picked up right after the call ended. My parents called the police and they advised us to come into the station. When we got there, we waited for a social worker who specializes in children's something, I forget. The police interviewed me when the social worker arrived. Then shortly thereafter, they raided the camp and subsequently found the clothing and equipment used in the ritual. They were hidden in a shed at the back of the camp. Most of the teachers at the camp had to do time for their actions. Some of them didn't because they were relatively new to the cult and/or had limited participation. As for the cult itself, it was a cell of a larger organization. The police didn't get to arrest the true leaders of the cult, but at the very least, they managed to put a few of the cultists behind bars. It's pretty insane to think about this again today. It makes me wonder what could have happened had the cult members been more experienced. I can't say for sure, but I believe things could have transpired very differently. I was 21 and still in college when I attended a beach party in the middle of summer. This was only 6 years ago. Back then, I drank a lot like most college students do around that age. It was business as usual on the day of the beach party. From what I gather, I got massively drunk at around 10 p.m. and just passed out right on the beach. When I woke up, the time was 2 in the morning. My friends were sleeping only a few steps away from me. I also saw a girl that I couldn't recognize completely passed out. They weren't getting up anytime soon. Anyway, my head was hurting and my stomach felt like a bomb had gone off inside it. I figured a stroll would help, and so I began walking by the beach. It felt nice when the waves washed over my feet and the sounds were quite soothing as well. I had walked quite the distance by the time I turned around to go back to my friends. That's when I saw a black inflatable dinghy coming close to the shore. Everything happened real quick. 3 or 4 men jumped off the dinghy and they ran toward my friends. I knew right away something was off, so I ran toward them as fast as I could. I saw the man put something on the mouths of two of my male friends and the one girl who had passed out right beside us. They dragged them onto the dinghy, and all of that happened in less than a minute. The dinghy was already heading out to the sea by the time I reached the scene. I was too late. I called 911 and tried to tell the operator that they should send out the Coast Guard in search of a black inflatable dinghy. I told her to do so before it's too late. Unfortunately, she refused to listen to me. The operator told me that the police were on the way and that I should explain everything to them. The police arrived after 10 minutes, and I couldn't stop crying when I saw them approaching me. I knew it was too late. 10 minutes is more than enough time to disappear on land in a vehicle. Now imagine 10 minutes out at sea on a motorized dinghy. They could be anywhere by that time. I explained everything to the cops as quickly as I could. The actual search officially began some 2 hours after my initial call to 911. It yielded nothing. My friends, along with the girl who had passed out next to us, were gone. No one knows what happened to them till this day. I was questioned by the police several times before the investigation was officially halted. For a while there, I thought they were trying to pin the whole thing on me. Fortunately, that didn't happen. 6 years of therapy, and I still think about that night every single day. I still wonder what might have happened had I continued to sleep with my friends on that beach. Could I have stopped the kidnappers? Would I have gotten kidnapped as well? It's been a recurring nightmare that refuses to stop. I can't let go of this guilt that logically I know I shouldn't have. I just can't help it. Not knowing what happened to my friends and that girl, imagining the horrific things they must have endured, I feel that I'm slowly going insane, and I don't think that I can stop that either. Ever since I can remember, I was always the weird kid in school. I would start a new semester, make a new friend, then lose him in a matter of days. A year goes by in the same school, and by then, everyone learns of the weird things I do. After a while, the whole town knows of my thing, and nobody wants to be seen near me. That's been my life. The thing that I do is involuntary. You see, I see things. I see people that are technically not real. I say technically because I once saw my dead neighbor. Mr. Wilson passed away in his home, surrounded by his family. His end came at 1:22 in the afternoon. I know this because I saw him looking at me from his window while his children were crying, watching the lifeless body of their father. So when I say that the people I see are technically not real, what I mean to say is that I see ghosts. I could already imagine you thinking that I'm crazy, but that doesn't bother me too much. Not anymore. I mean, I've heard it all. They said I was mentally ill, that I was an attention seeker, and lots of other mean things. Words don't hurt me so easily anymore. My life is stressful to say the least. It's not easy to distinguish the dead from the living, and that sometimes makes me do some weird things. Like say I would go around a person who isn't blocking my path. That's got to look weird. There were also times when I spoke to people who weren't actually real. You make those mistakes year after year, then eventually you learn that it's best to keep to yourself. That's why I don't make friends. Not that I ever could when I tried. But anyway, I also avoid crowded places. At least I try to limit my exposure to those places. I work as a security guard. I purposely chose a night shift. My life is simple. I commute to work late at night, then come home early in the morning when people are scarce on the streets. I go home, play video games, watch YouTube, go to bed, and the cycle repeats the next morning. Lately though, I've been getting some unwanted guests in my apartment. Normally, spirits don't follow me home. I'm 27 years old, and there were only a few instances of such happenings. The first time, a spirit of a boy stayed at my place for a day. Then there was an old lady who stayed for a week until one day she just went away. And there were other instances that were uneventful. They don't bother me or speak to me. They just stay standing for the most part. Sometimes you see them walk around a bit, but that's about the extent of action I get from the spirits that follow me. And that's why the latest incidents have been really strange. The spirits have been much more active. They walk around in my apartment all the time, and sometimes they gaze at me for hours on. It's a little unsettling at times, but I manage to ignore them most of the times. My life has been challenging to say the least, thanks to the gift I was born with. However, I've managed to make things work. I didn't let myself go crazy. I've built a system that I can rely on to make sure I don't burden those around me. Things are changing though, and I just hope I'm ready to adapt once again. I just can't catch a break. Sometimes I think I'm the unluckiest person alive, but at times I do wonder if I may be a functioning, mentally ill person. Like, not crazy enough to harm someone else, but crazy enough to see things that aren't real. Spirits don't scare me, but the thought of me actually being insane sends shivers down my spine. Hey guys, I just wanted to tell you that in the stories from overseas, I've changed the names of the characters to make it easier for me to pronounce them. So just keep that in mind when you listen to stories from Poland, Russia, and others. It'll be the same deal for future videos as well. And that's it. Enjoy the video. In my second year in college, I was staying at my best friend's due to financial difficulties. Gina was renting a one-bedroom apartment some 5 minutes away from school, and she let me stay with her until I could secure my own place. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays were my late arrival days. Gina had a boyfriend, a 30-year-old architect, and they liked to get it on after work sometimes. So Gina and we settled for those 3 days out of the week as fudge days, and thus I would come home late. Tuesdays and Wednesdays I had work after school, but Thursdays were painful to find ways to burn the time. I didn't want to spend money unnecessarily, and so my favorite place to hang out was at our school. One day, and this was one of those painful Thursdays, I was at the library and the time was around 5 p.m. I was browsing through Instagram on my phone and I had this weird feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around the library and everyone seemed to be busy doing their own thing. But then I looked outside through the window and there was a man looking at me from maybe 30 yards out. I thought at first I could be mistaken. Maybe he was looking in my general direction, but no, he was definitely eyeing me. I looked at him for a while because normally guys stop looking at you when they realize you've noticed their gaze. But this guy, he didn't give a crap. He had his target sighted and he wasn't about to look away. So I did the next best thing. I looked away and didn't give him the attention he wanted. 5 minutes later, I know for certain he's still looking. I was kind of annoyed by it and therefore I opened the camera app and began taking photos of the creep. It was only then that he had left and it felt so relieving. But anyway, I walked around the campus for a while and went back to the library to burn the last hour before I could go home. When the clock hit 10 p.m., I grabbed my bag and I was headed home. I was outside of the campus area in 2 minutes and walking on Skillman Avenue when a dark figure emerged from a narrow alleyway and bear hugged me from the side. Looking back, I think he wanted to grab me from behind, but he had timed it wrong. In any event, he quickly adjusted his position and in seconds he had his left hand over my mouth and his right arm wrapped around my neck. The creep wasn't even that much bigger than me, but he was so much stronger that I could barely move. The self-defense class I took 6 months ago was a total BS. In real situation against a strong man, you're just not going to be able to free yourself on your own. I was being dragged further into the alleyway and there was nothing that I could do to stop it. Also, the area around the alleyway is a commercial district for like 3-block radius. The offices in that area are vacated by latest 7, and there's literally no one at around 10 p.m. I felt hopeless and terrified. I had never felt so much fear. I tried to scream, scratch him, and grab at the wall to try to stop the creep from dragging me further. We were almost at the end of the alleyway when I heard someone running toward us. Soon, the creep noticed, he let me go and hopped over the wall behind us, stepping over the dumpster. In just seconds, a man came running toward me and told me to call the police. He was going to give chase, but then I quickly grabbed his hand and begged him to stay. I could see the frustration on his face. He really wanted to catch the guy. But I was so scared that I wasn't about to let go of him. He stayed with me until the police arrived. We did the usual thing you do with the police. They asked me if I needed an ambulance. I said no, went to the police station, told them the whole thing, and all the while, my knight in shining armor was there until the end. Of course, he had to give his account to them as well. Josh was the name of the hero, and I was so lucky because by some random chance, he stayed late in his office that particular night. He told me that he opened the windows in his office because the air felt dry, and that's how he was able to hear my muffled scream. Despite the danger, he didn't hesitate to intervene, and that's why I'm able to write this story to you today. As pathetic as it may sound, I was madly in love with Josh at the time. It was not to be, however, as he had a girlfriend at that particular period in his life. I had lunch with him and his girlfriend a few days thereafter, and that was the last time I saw him. I carried a pepper spray for a while, but then my paranoia died down a few months down the line. Today, I feel safe again and feel no residual effect from the horrendous encounter with the creep. I hear I'm lucky. They say some women never get over the experience. It's a terrible thing, so I feel fortunate to be able to live a normal life. I get around places just fine, but then most of the times my husband's next to me, and I suppose that's one additional source of confidence in my life. Everyone, be smart out there. I could have chosen to call my friend and tell her that I wanted to come home early, but I didn't. I could have taken the longer route to where there are more people, but I didn't. When in doubt, always take the safer path. You've got nothing to lose in the long run, so always be safe with the choices you make. I was 15 years old when my family and I moved from Boston to Virginia. I was obviously new in school and had to make new friends all over again. I was never the shy type, but for some reason this time around, I was having difficulties making new friends. A month after enrolling, I still didn't have people that I would call friends. I said hi to a few guys, but that was about it. That is, until I met Justine. She wasn't my girlfriend or anything like that. Justine was genuinely just a friend, a good friend at that too. The first time I said hi to her was during lunch hour. She was in one corner of the large tables we have in the cafeteria. I saw her for a month and she always sat alone. My situation wasn't that much better, but I would always end up eating with some random guys and manage to at least strike up a conversation. I figured she's alone and I'm alone, so I might as well say hi. That's what I did, and that's how we became friends. Although I will say, it wasn't easy to convince her to open up to me. That part took a while. I'd say it took a good month for us to become friends. At any rate, we were walking home one day after school when we came across a box with full of kittens inside. I said to Justine that I would take the kittens home and see if I could get a few adopted. The rest, I assumed, would have to take them to the local animal shelter. I grabbed the box with both hands, and that's when Justine took one of the kittens from it. She grabbed it in a way that her hand would palm the kitten's back. Now, you would think she'd go all goo goo gaga on it, but that's not exactly what happened. Justine began squeezing the kitten so hard that it made a sound which eerily sounded like a person struggling to scream. I said to her angrily, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Then proceeded to free the kitten from her hand. She told me that she was sorry, but truth be told, I didn't see any remorse in her eyes. She was so calm and distant, her reaction to what she did, it almost seemed calculated, as if it was as though she knew she had to act guilty and taken aback, but couldn't do it naturally. I didn't unfriend her or treat her differently after that, but suffice it to say, I didn't feel the same way about her as I did when I first met her. More things happened after that, nothing as shocking as the kitten incident, but surely some head-scratchers. I did end up telling her to fudge off one day. There was this one final incident which broke the camel's back. We went to a swimming pool on a Saturday, and aside from us, there were mostly kids playing in the pool. It seemed as though a couple of parents had brought a bunch of kids in their neighborhood. The two mothers were having a conversation, the lifeguard seemed disinterested, and the kids were sort of unsupervised. Anyway, I asked Justine if she wanted to race me, and she declined the challenge, citing fatigue. I told her I wanted to do one more lap before we leave. I swam toward one end of the pool and was coming back to where Justine was waiting for me, when I saw something strange where she was floating. There seemed to be a kid next to Justine, and he was underwater. When I got close enough, I realized that Justine had the boy pinned down underwater. I swam faster toward them, and when I got close enough, I swatted Justine's hands away from the boy. The boy began crying the moment I pulled his head out of the water. The two ladies by the pool came running, and Justine told them that she was merely playing with him. She said to the boy, "I'm sorry, but you're the one who wanted to wrestle. You were barely 3 seconds in the water." Imagine that, a pretty girl who's young enough to be your daughter was just being nice to your son. Of course the boy got himself in trouble. Surely the pretty young girl could never even dream of hurting him. Yeah, the boy ended up getting reprimanded. And as for Justine, she got an apology from the mother. I told my mom about the whole deal, and she suspected of Justine being a sociopath. Mom told me not to judge her too quickly though, and she actually bothered to meet up with Justine's parents for a discussion. After all was said and done, Mom had ordered me to never hang out with Justine again. She said that her parents knew that Justine was showing signs of sociopathic behaviors. They weren't admitting it outright, but they said enough to know what's what. I stopped hanging out with Justine after that, and it wasn't because of my mom. I wouldn't have continued being friends with her regardless. The incident at the pool was more than enough to convince me that she was far from normal. And yeah, that was the end of that. Justine and her family moved to another state a year thereafter, and I haven't seen them ever since. They say roughly 1% of the world population are sociopaths. I have found one and even became friends with her. That makes me wonder, just how many sociopaths have I really met so far? And are some of them still in my life right now? That's truly terrifying to think of. I lived in a student housing during the first 2 years in college. Then in my third year, I moved into an apartment and got a roommate in the process. I specifically looked for a ground floor apartment, and I had found one nearby school. I was run over by a car when I was 9, and I've had chronic knee pain ever since. Floors are my worst enemy, and therefore it's important to me that I don't overwork my knees. Most of the smaller apartments don't have elevators. Thus, ground floor apartments are a must for me. Anyhow, my roommate was this girl from nutrition class. Her name's Lydia, and I barely knew her at the time. I just really needed a roommate, and she happened to need one as well. Basically, we got together because we needed each other is all. But yeah, once Lydia moved in, it took less than a week for her to show her true colors. She's well put together in public spaces, but she's a pig at home. I wouldn't mind that so much if she was filthy in her room and in her room only. But the filthy pig left her dishes unwashed for days and kept pushing back her turns to clean the bathroom. Her laziness was becoming a problem. 2 months after she moved in, I was ready to have one last conversation with her before I kicked her out of the apartment for good. I came home after school, fully committed to giving Lydia an earful. I opened the door to my apartment and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was so clean everywhere. The kitchen was absent of dirty dishes, the bathroom smelled like Clorox, and the living room was all vacuumed up. I thought for sure Lydia felt a change of attitude in me. She must have known my patience was running out and finally decided to take some responsibilities. That day, I told myself that I would give her a pass for all that she didn't do in the past. Lydia was going to get a blank slate. We didn't speak. I didn't commend her for acting like an adult for once. I just let it slide. Another 2 months went by and the process repeated every couple of weeks. The apartment would get dirty, really dirty, then Lydia would clean up after herself right before I was ready to dish out an ass whooping. With that being said, there was another problem that was creeping up. Lydia began to take my underwears from the laundry basket. She probably thought that I wouldn't notice if she took 1 or 2 panties every couple of weeks. Well, I did notice it. I sat her down and spoke to her about it. She swore to me that she didn't take them. I didn't believe her, of course, but at the same time, it's not like I had the proof of the theft. Anyway, we ended up having an argument and Lydia moved out a month later. About 2 months after Lydia had moved out, I came home early one day because my knees were giving me problems again. I opened the door and right in front of me was the superintendent going through my laundry basket. I froze by the door like something had a hold of me. We made eye contact, seconds passed, when all of a sudden the super charged at me. I thought for sure I was done for, but he just pushed me aside and ran out through the door. I locked the door behind him like that would matter seeing as how he had the keys. But anyhow, I called the police right away and the super was arrested 3 hours later. As it turns out, it was the super who had cleaned my apartment. Lydia had never once vacuumed while she stayed here, nor did she clean the stinky bathroom. It was the super all along, and he took my panties as payment, I suppose. In the end, the creep was sentenced for 6 months in jail, and he was required to take a reform education of sort. I guess he wasn't the worst of the creeps, but I do wonder if that's how they become more daring. They start small by stealing dirty panties and move up to something more sinister. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, he's out of jail now and back in society. I would hate to imagine what he'd become if my hypothesis is correct. So yeah, I really hope I'm wrong. In 2005, I was 15 years old and a brand new orphan. My mom had left me long ago and Dad had gone back to jail only 2 weeks before my 17th birthday. Yeah, gone back, meaning he's been to jail more times than I can count. I was picked up by my uncle on the same day my father had been arrested. Uncle knew Dad was going away for a while. He told me I could stay with him until I turned 18. Uncle hated my dad, and for good reasons too. They were brothers, but so different. My father is a lifelong drunken crook, and Uncle is ever so stoic, but an upstanding citizen and a devout Christian. The complete opposite of my father. Anyway, I was told I'd be using the basement as my space. He told me that he'll be installing a bathroom and a small sink for me there. I was told to respect the privacy of his family and that they would do the same for me. Uncle didn't say it outright, but he wanted as little interaction as possible between me and his children. He knew I'd be a bad influence, and he was right too. Even today, I still carry my father's burden. Some of his bad habits have definitely rubbed off on me when I was young. It took me a while to shed most of them. Anyway, I was transferred to the same school that my cousins attended. My uncle had 2 kids. Damien was the younger one, he was 14 at the time, and Jessica was 16, a year older than me. We didn't interact much in school. I think they were told by my uncle to stay away from me. Don't get me wrong, they weren't bad kids. In school, Damien was always the one to say hi first, and he was always full of smiles. Jessica was also nice. She always offered to give me a ride home, although I always felt as though I had to decline. Think of it as a courtesy to my uncle. Keeping myself at a distance from his children was the least I could do for him for taking me in. After spending 2 months at uncle's, he began to soften up a bit. I wasn't getting good grades in school, but I was passing. I kept the basement in an immaculate condition, even the spaces I wasn't using. I would also mow the lawn and clean the gutter on a regular basis. I had hoped to appeal to him that I wasn't as bad as my father. I remember one day Uncle had asked me if I wished to go to church with him and his family. I said yes, and for the first time, I saw my uncle being happy of what I said. 6 months in, I still wasn't all that close to my uncle and his family, but I'll say this, we were definitely much more comfortable with each other's presence. One day, some 8 months after having moved to my uncle's, I was walking home after school and about half a block away from my uncle's. Around that time, the only car I should be seeing in the driveway was of either Jessica's or her best friend's. But I saw a car that looked very much like the one that belongs to Marcus. Marcus was a senior in our school with a bright future in drug dealing and assault. As you might imagine, the sight of his car was enough to make me nervous. I walked into the house and heard the music playing loudly on the second floor. I had never once been to the second floor up to that point. I had set my boundary to the entrance and the kitchen. But on that day, I had to break that boundary. I went upstairs and thought for a second if I should knock on Jessica's door or not. Things were going well with this family and I didn't want to ruin that. After a minute or two, I had decided to check on her and knocked on the door. Seconds passed, but nothing. I knock again, still nothing. That's when I tried opening the door and found it to be locked. I don't know what it was that made me feel urgent, but something inside of me told me to break the door down. I did. I squared up my shoulder, then began ramming the door with all I had. As it turns out, house doors are useless. 5 hits were all it took for the door frame to break. Anyhow, the door opened and I saw Jessica half naked on the bed and Marcus standing in front of her. Jessica looked to be drugged up and Marcus was ready to pounce on me. I jumped in first and began to punch the daylights out of him. I wanted to knock him out, subdue him, then call the police, but of course Marcus had other ideas. I was on top of him, landing punches after punches, when Marcus grabbed the metal statue that had fallen on the floor during the struggle and he busted my forehead open with it. I was dazed for a few seconds, and that's all it took for him to run away. By the time I chased after Marcus all the way to the front door, he was already pulling out of the driveway. I called the police right away and Uncle after that. Both me and Jessica were taken to the hospital, and neither of us were injured too badly. I had come home before Marcus could do a lot more harm to her. As for me, I had some stitches and some bruises. Nothing I couldn't handle. As it turns out, Jessica was actually dating Marcus. She was in love with him, God knows why, and he was obviously just using her. Anyway, he wanted to do it, but she didn't, so he resorted to his lowly tactics and drugged her up to have his way with her. A week went by and Marcus was still at large. Uncle had taken some time off and was staying at home with Jessica. Aunt was going to take over the care duty a week after. By this point, I was already back in school after a couple of days of rest. But Uncle had asked me if I could stay home the week after when he had to go back to work. This was for only if Marcus hadn't been caught by then. I told him that I would actually feel more comfortable with that. I too was worried about Aunt and Jessica being home by themselves. At any rate, I went to bed late that night after the talk. I felt happy that Uncle and his family saw me differently now. They really did appreciate what I had done for Jessica. I was too giddy to fall asleep. 3 hours later, the time was 2 in the morning and I was sleeping soundly. Suddenly, I felt something cold in my stomach and the sensation repeated as I woke up. I wanted to get up, but for some reason, I felt weak. Then I saw someone standing near the window in the basement. Yeah, it was a semi-basement and we had 3 medium-sized windows where I slept. I tried to get up and that's when I felt something warm on my stomach. Then I fell on the floor. The intruder ran toward the window at the far end of the corner, but it tripped while trying to climb out and kicked the toolbox that was on a desk. That made a loud noise and I could see that the intruder was panicking as he climbed out the window. I was lying on the floor and I put my hand on my stomach. I could feel my shirt had gotten wet and it was warm. That's when I realized I was bleeding. I tried to scream for help, but try as I might, I could only make faint sounds. I thought I was going to die, but then I heard someone coming down from upstairs. Uncle had heard the toolbox falling on the floor and he had come to check on me. I don't remember anything after that. I had fainted and woke up in the hospital 2 days later. I guess it's obvious, but I survived the attack. It was Marcus who had attempted to murder me, and he had failed. The idiot was caught on the same night of the attack, and with him being 18, he was going to be behind bars for quite some time before he could taste freedom again. As for the specifics of the attack, I had been stabbed 7 times in the abdomen and the chest. Marcus could have easily hit something that could have killed me almost instantly, but by some miracle, all the critical organs had been spared. It took me 10 months to fully heal from the injuries. By that point, Uncle had sold the old house and we had moved into a bigger one. In the old house, there were only 3 bedrooms, and that's one of the reasons why I stayed in the basement. Uncle wanted me to have a proper room. I appreciated that he went through all that trouble just to put me in a bedroom. I've been living a trouble-free life after that. I went to a trade school after high school and learned to become a carpenter. I make a decent living running my own business and I'm currently saving up to get married next year. As for Uncle and his family, they are all doing well. Uncle is still strict and stoic. He continues to work hard and live as an upstanding citizen. Aunt retired 2 years ago and she took up a hobby in farming. Well, mini farming since it's only the backyard that's being farmed. Also, Damien moved to Georgia after college graduation. He was hired by a company that's situated there. Lastly, Jessica got married after college and she now has 2 kids. I still have nightmares about the night of the attack, if you can believe that. I'm 6'4", 240 pounds. I look like a big running back and people think I'm as tough as they come. But little do they know, I often wake up in the arms of my fiancée, sweating and panting from the horrors of the night. I've been seeing a shrink for the last 6 months and I think it's been good for me. Elizabeth, that's my fiancée by the way, she suggested it for a couple of years now, but it took me a while to accept that I needed help. I want to get better. I think I am getting better. My fiancé repeats this saying to me every time I'm down. Adversity causes some men to break, others to break records. I am the byproduct of the graciousness of my uncle, aunt, and cousins. They owed me nothing, but they gave me plenty to succeed in life. I see people complain all the time how there's no hope in this world. And yet to me, to someone who's been dealt such a rotten hand, it's so apparent that there's still so much love and beauty in this world. By all means, call out those who do evil, but try to set your sight on what's good in this world. Life is so much more joyous when you live as such. I am the living proof of that. I was born and raised in the same town that I currently reside in. This is the only home I know, and it would stay that way if I had it my way. However, currently as things are, our local economy has been tanking over the last 30 years, and the town is barely holding on to its residents. I'm sorry, that was just a long-winded way of saying that my town is crappy. But yeah, the reason why I mentioned the poor state of my town is so that you'd understand why we have so many empty homes and buildings around town. Ironically, when I was only a few years younger, having so many empty buildings around town was actually really awesome. Me and my friends had so many places to explore. And sometimes, when we got really lucky, we would find unsold products that the original owners of the stores didn't bother to take. It was a lot of fun. Having mentioned all of that, I'm going to take you back to the year 2015 when I was 13 years old. It was on a Sunday at around 2 p.m. My best friend Miles and I, we were exploring a local shopping center that had gone belly up some 10 years ago. That day, our plan was to scavenge as many metal display shelves as we could. My dad gave us the go-ahead to use one of the sheds in the backyard as me and Miles's little HQ. I had been begging him for that space for half a year, and had finally gotten the permission. Long story short, my room and my sister's are situated right next to each other. So with only a thin wall separating the two rooms, my sister made one too many noise complaint to mom and dad for me to have a normal 13-year-old social life. That's why I needed the shed, and the shed required some redecorating. Shelves were needed for that. Miles and I were at the center of the shopping mall when we heard people coming in from the west side of the entrance. We quickly hid in one of the changing rooms at the Once Upon a Time clothing store. We had to hide because we knew some questionable persons did use the building to conduct their shady businesses from time to time. They were more than likely kids from our school, but it's not smart to take chances on something that can get you offed. So anyway, me and Miles are inside a changing room. Both of us have our backs against the inner wall to make sure our feet are not seen so easily. Unless, of course, someone ducks under to see what's under the curtain. But we were hidden fairly well. About 20 seconds passes and we hear several men arguing about something. As they get closer, it becomes apparent that something sinister is happening. We hear a girl begging to be freed, followed by someone hitting her, then the girl sobbing. From the loudness of their voices, we can tell they were standing right in front of the store we were hiding in. Now, the conversation is heard much clearly. One of the men says, "Yo, it's better to wait for the next shipment and ship this girl with them. Why would you double the chances of getting caught by using two trucks for two separate deliveries?" Then another man responds, "This is a shipping hub, you dumbass. Products don't stay here, they get shipped out of here. You stay here long enough and you get kids coming in to snoop around the place. Then what happens? We'll have to ship those kids out too, and our business in this town will be over. Then what are you gonna do? Where will you find a better place to do business than this shithole of a town? So no, she gets shipped out right now. Call the driver." We could hear the first guy to talking to someone on the phone. Presumably, he's calling the driver. I continue to hear the girl sobbing, and I feel like I have to do something to help her. I take my phone out and gesture for Miles to do the same. Then I show him that I'm putting the phone in silent mode, and Miles does the same. I proceed to text my dad, mom, and sister to let them know what's happening. Shortly thereafter, I get a reply from my dad which reads, "Stay put, do not intervene. We call the police and they'll be there shortly." Seconds later, Dad sends another message to make himself clear. It reads, "I will kill you myself if you do anything stupid. Stay put, let the police do their job." After that, I hand over the phone to Miles and show him the messages. He nods, and now we play the waiting game. As the seconds dragged on, we hear the girl getting slapped a couple of times. Then one of the men says, "I'm gonna be riding on the back of the truck with you. You just wait, girl. I've got a big surprise for you." I don't know this girl, and logically speaking, I shouldn't care much about what happens to her. But why am I so angry and in such a pain to have to listen to her suffer? I don't know if this makes me a terrible person, but if I'm honest, if I had a gun with me, I'd take down every single one of the kidnappers outside. Minutes that feel like hours pass when suddenly there's a loud commotion outside. The cavalry had arrived. We heard the cops yelling, "Hands up and on the ground," or something of that matter. It is chaotic outside, but no shots have been fired so far. About 5 minutes later, we hear someone approaching the changing rooms. Both Miles and I raise our hand up because we know it's the cops outside and we want them to know we are harmless. One of the police officers opens the curtain and says to us, "You must be the guys who tipped us," to which we both nodded. The officer continued, "Put your hands down and follow me. The suspects have been arrested and taken out of the building. I'm going to take you guys through the south side of the exit so we can keep your identities concealed." And yeah, that's how the whole thing wrapped up. The creeps were sent to jail after a trial. I heard the girl was okay and she was sent to her family. And me and Miles got a personal thank you from the captain of the police department that responded to the call. It felt really good to have done the right thing. Miles and I, we couldn't have been happier that the girl was saved. Sadly, however, the current news of my town isn't all that good. We still have many criminals who use our town to do their business. The small number of cops cannot be hoped to patrol all the abandoned buildings around town. Who knows what goes on in those places on a daily basis? It's scary to think that I live in the epicenter of crimes in our region. My dad says he might get a job in the city, and we are possibly moving out of this godforsaken place once and for all. I can't wait to feel safe again outside. I hope Miles and his family will soon get out of this town as well. It's sad to feel this way since I've made so many great memories with my friends here. But that's the reality and I no longer want to be part of it. I used to work as a high school security guard from the year 2002 through 2009. I don't recall the exact year, but I think it was either in the year 2003 or 4 when I had witnessed something truly inexplicable. So here's how things used to work in the old school. Period 1 starts at 8 a.m. and the last period, period 9, ends at 3:30 p.m. When school ends, most kids leave the premises, for the exception of a few who may be talking to a teacher. So bottom line, the classrooms are empty by latest 4 p.m. every day. We are supposed to do our rounds until 5 p.m. when everyone, for the exception of the janitors and at times, the principals, stay past the regular hours of operation. It was around 4:30 when I was sweeping the second floor that I saw a student still seated in a classroom. It was a female student and she looked really young. I went over to her and said, "What are you doing in the classroom? School ended an hour ago." I waited for her to say sorry, whoops, or something along those lines, then leave. But she didn't respond at all. In fact, she didn't even look in my direction. Okay, I need the second floor to be empty. That's the only way I get to go home. So, will you please leave? I pleaded with her. But again, I didn't even get an acknowledgement of my presence. A couple of seconds passes when Jeffrey, one of the janitors in school, says to me, "Go home, Roger." I turn around and respond, "I'm trying, but this girl won't let me go." To which Jeffrey responded, "What girl?" So then I said, "This girl," as I turned around, but the girl was no longer in her chair. The classroom was empty. I looked in Jeffrey's direction and asked, "That can't be right. Didn't you see a girl when you stepped into the classroom? Yay tall and freshman young?" "Nah, man, it was just you in this empty classroom." "Man, stop trying to scare me. Do you know how creepy things get when y'all live?" Jeffrey complained. "Yeah, sorry, I was just kidding." I sort of just mumbled and walked out of the classroom. I finished my sweep, then got out of the school at around 5 p.m. As I drove home, I tried to reason with myself that I must have been spooked and imagined the whole thing. The truth is, I knew I was knowingly BSing myself. I had never been one to get scared of ghost stories or other similar nonsense. I wouldn't imagine seeing things because I've never believed there were real ghosts in our world. At least, not after I turned 10 years old. But regardless, it was easier on my mind to chalk it up to being spooked. So that's what I did. Only that lie I made up was unfortunately Debunked a week later. I had seen the girl again, and again, and again. You get my drift. The good thing is, the girl really didn't do much. I saw her walking in the hallway a few times, but mostly she just sat in the classroom. Obviously, I was scared of her initially. With time, however, I began to feel bad for the girl. It's not what she said or did that made me feel that way. I think it was the aura of sadness that she carried with her. If that makes sense. I saw her one last time in the winter of 2009 before I quit working school security. Even today in 2019, I often wonder if she's still around. I should mention one thing before I close off. I did do a little investigation of the girl while I still worked the security job. I have found the names of several deceased students who have attended the school, but I couldn't find anything that stood out. A few kids died in car accidents, a couple of them were taken by cancer, and so on. I didn't find a single student who would have the reason to frequent the school after death. So yeah, I never got to find out why the spirit of the young girl showed up in the same classroom. I just hope it wasn't anything tragic or sinister that has sealed her fate. Although her not being able to move on sort of hints at something unfortunate. Well, I pray that I'm wrong, and I hope that she'll somehow find her way to God. Five years ago, I was 14 years old and still in school. Back then, we had this kid who used to get bullied all the time by the so-called cool kids in school. For this story, I'm going to name the victim of the bullying Anton, and we'll call the bullies the bullies. Anton didn't really fit the mold of the typical bully victim. I think the easiest way of describing him is average. He was average in height, weight, attractiveness, grades, you name it. I was one of the average kids in school, and so I know a thing or two about being average. Generally, we are invisible in school. Boys tend to bully the smallest of the boys, and the girls tend to bully the ugliest girls in school. So it was kinda puzzling how Anton ended up becoming the main plaything of the bullies, seeing as how there were several other easier targets. Having said that, I can't fathom how Anton was able to cope with the bullying throughout the years. I mean, seeing him get beat up was almost a daily event, but that wasn't even the worst of the things he had to endure. During the winter, I saw Anton walk home without a jacket on a couple of occasions. If he wore anything decent, the bullies would always take it from him. I can't for the life of me understand how cruel and inhumane someone has to be to make anyone walk outside without a jacket in the middle of the Russian winter. But the worst, the real worst, happened one day in September. It was after school had ended, and I was right outside the front gate with my best friend. We heard a commotion from nearby and saw a bunch of kids running toward the screams and laughter. I ran toward it as well, and my best friend followed. I had to turn away as soon as I got to the source of the commotion. It was again Anton getting bullied, and this time the bullies had crossed the line. Anton was fully naked on the ground crying. The bullies had his clothes, and they laughed at him as they passed around Anton's pants and jacket. I was going to walk away, but something pulled me back toward Anton. I walked over to him, took off my jacket, then placed it on top of his trembling naked body. I then looked straight in the eyes of the main bully, the kid who always leads the bullying. I told him, "You are a garbage human being and you'll never amount to anything in your life. There will come a day when you remember what you've done today. The day when you get thrown into jail and you get to be made into a plaything of the inmates. You will scream and cry as they have their way with you. You will regret everything, all that you've done in your life." I then pointed at the rest of the bullies and told them, "Each and every one of you will suffer greatly for what you've done today. Mark my words, you will all pay for your sins." I don't know what came over me on that day. I'm not a confrontational person. I get along to get along. I'm that type of a person. Regardless, I snatched Anton's clothes from the hands of the bullies. I then began to help Anton put his clothes back on. Something beautiful happened after that. The other kids, they began to form a wall of jackets around Anton. They took their jackets off, spread them far apart, then turned around to give Anton a private space where he could get dressed. The bullies walked away with their tails between their legs. And the truly great thing is, they stopped bullying Anton after that. The bullies became the enemy of everyone in school. Kids refused to do group projects with any of their members. No one wanted to be associated with them. The bullies were finally getting a taste of their own medicine. Today, 5 years later, Anton is a good friend of mine and is currently attending college in St. Petersburg. As for the bullies, I don't know that I can say that I'm happy of how their lives turned out, but the mumbo-jumbos I spoke on that fateful day came true. 2 of the bullies are currently serving time for a barrage of crimes, including assault and robbery. One of the girls is a druggie, and she asks for change at the corner of a supermarket near the old school. I know that one guy had died in a car accident and another girl who became a prostitute. I'm not so naive to think that every bad person in this world get what they deserve. But at least in our school, justice was served. I've never done anything as brave as defending Anton on that day. That was a single occurrence in my life. Still, it was a good lesson. Sometimes, it takes only one person to make a difference. A good difference in this world. I used to live in a small town in Arizona when I was 16 years old. My parents had gotten divorced the year prior, and Mom and I had to move there to start over. At the time, I understood why she had to move, but still, it was a bad deal for me. Think about it. I was 16 years old in a new school. I had no friends, no money, and no father. In a small town of all places. You couldn't draw up a better scenario for a kid to have the worst high school experience ever. As you may imagine, I struggled to make friends and became a loner in time. I used to walk home alone after school. Because for one, Mom barely made enough money to cover the rent and their car. And 2, I had no friends who would drive or walk me home. If you walked to school, the best way to get there was to go right through the town center. The town hall, a small theater, a diner, and about a dozen stores were located in that area. They had plenty more buildings for businesses to occupy, but at the time, the town's economy was in a bad shape. Naturally, I passed by many empty stores on the way to school. Looking back, that was a really depressing walk I had to do every single day. I didn't really think about it at the time, but it was akin to walking through an abandoned town. In any event, I was passing by an empty store that was formerly a clothing store when something spooked the heck out of me. You see, the store was completely empty when I passed it on the way to school. But now there was a mannequin and a couch inside. For the record, the mannequin was positioned in a sitting pose on the couch. Looking through the storefront, I thought it was a person for a second, and that's why I got startled. I stopped in front of the store for some 5 seconds thinking, I guess they're opening a new store here. Good luck. After that day, I continued doing the walk 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Without any friends to speak to and hang out with, I was really lonely. I remember waving at the mannequin every time I passed the store. Then, after a few days, I actually gave it a name and said, hi, hello, or how are you? On my way to and from school. Days had passed. I think it may have been about 10 days after the mannequin had showed up at the store. I saw 2 police cruisers and a white van with some type of a code written on the side parked in front of Benjamin's. Yeah, that's the name I gave the mannequin. At any rate, I crossed the street so I wouldn't bother the police doing their thing and just went home. Mom came home at 10 p.m. after finishing her shift at the diner. I gave her a big hug because she looked so spent. Then she gave me a kiss on the forehead and told me that she had something to tell me. She basically told me that I no longer had to walk to school. She had divided her shift into two so she could drop me off at school in the morning, then pick me up after school in the afternoon. I told her I didn't want her to do that. Her schedule was already grueling and I didn't want to make things even harder for her. That's when she explained to me why she was making the changes. The police car and the van after school, they were there to pick up a corpse. Benjamin was not a mannequin. He was a person. Well, used to be. Someone had killed him and used him as a prop for the storefront. You gotta be sick in the head to do something like that. For God's sake, how creepy is it that I said hello to a dead body like he was a living person? But anyway, Benjamin was from out of town. We don't know why or how he was killed, nor how he was brought into town. From what I know, the police didn't even have a suspect and the case went cold after a while. Nothing else happened in town after that. And I mean that literally. Nothing actually happens in that town. Which in some ways was a good thing. I went to school there for 2 years without any trouble. Mom saved enough money to move to somewhere better within that time. Then we were out of there at the first chance we had. I'm not a loner anymore if you are interested. I'm 32 years old today with a kid of my own and a husband who supports me through and through. Unlike my father, Mom's still kicking and enjoying life. She lives in an apartment only 3 blocks away from me. I want her near me and my husband's very understanding of that. And that's it really. Benjamin didn't turn into a ghost and visit me every night. No, I said bye to Benjamin on the day that it was taken, and I hadn't thought about him until recently when I decided to send you my story. It's a little unsettling that the killer was never found, but then Benjamin's killer isn't the only killer at large in this world. Life goes on, it is what it is, I suppose.